Myles Downey. Welcome to the Coach's Journey podcast.
It's a great pleasure, Robbie. Thank you for having me.
I said to you when I first reached out to you that I read Effective Modern Coaching when I was thinking about it this week. I think I was when I was maybe still even doing the original coaching training that I did about 6.5 years ago. And my manager at the time, Alicia, gave me the book. In fact, let me get my copy in case anyone was watching this. What's great about this copy of the book is that I carried it around in my bag so much that at some point I spilt coffee on it, which shows, among other things, that it was definitely well used. And what's been lovely about knowing we were having this conversation and reading that book and also getting more into your work, like immersing myself in it just a little bit in preparation for this call, was to feel the impact of that on my coaching. I was watching a really nice, we'll put a link to this for people who want in the wherever the people are listening, a really nice coaching session of yours that's on YouTube for JMJ, I think. And that reading, I'm skipping back through Effective Modern Coaching gave me it as well, but watching that was just so great to see that in action and just notice the kind of how that is a part. Some of the things that I learned from you from that book years ago is still a part of my coaching 6.5 years later. And partly I wanted to say that just because I think it's a cool thing to be able to say to you because we're on a call now. And partly because I don't know how you feel about this, but coaching is a strange profession in terms of the impact that we have. I sometimes think, how do we know what is the impact that we're having? How do we know the kind of ripples of our work? And it's nice to give me an opportunity to say to you, there's some ripples of your work, which not just on me, but of course to the clients that I've worked with. So thanks so much for all that.
It's great to hear. Thank you.
Yeah. And maybe as I often do on this podcast, the place we'll go next is to really rewind to, I guess there's two ways you could answer this, but I'll just ask you the question, which is, where did you first come across coaching?
In my late teens, I was a relatively good tennis player. So as a Dubliner and an Irishman, you can construe relatively in any way you choose. But as I studied architecture, and as I was spending my holidays playing tennis in the evenings and tournaments, I'd coach during the day, and that's how some people go get summer jobs. My summer job was to train and coach people in tennis, and actually, it's a bit like kind of lots of Americans go and serve in restaurants and cafes when they're students, and they learn about how to interact with people. It was a wonderful early discipline just because it taught you so much about taking care of somebody else, watching somebody else, listening to somebody else, and responding to what you were seeing. And then I came upon a book which was Tim Gallwey's Inner Game of Tennis. And it was just a revelation, but it was a revelation in the sense of I kind of knew what I was reading before I read it. So I'd be wondering something as I was turning a page, and Tim would go and then answer what I was wondering or respond to what I was wondering. And that was the first moment of transformation, because within a couple of weeks of reading the book, a guy called Graham Alexander, who later went on to set up the Alexander Corporation, and I was part of that, deputized for Tim on Irish television. And by sheer coincidence, I got invited to an on-court event that he did the next day. And I was from that moment on, I was actually working in an architect's office. And it was clear to me that which one was going to win the pull. So yeah, that was the very beginning. And then over the years, I trained as an inner game coach. I met Tim. I've invited Tim over here to the UK and London, and actually deputized for him on one occasion in the States. So there's been a really productive relationship with Tim. So I think that was the beginning.
Yeah. And I read in something you wrote that you just kind of found that book in your house.
Yeah.
Is that true? And like, where
Yeah.
did it, because it sounds like an amazing piece of synergy in you, especially the way you describe, wandering. It's like you were clearly in alignment with Tim or what he'd written and really ready for it. But why was it there? Do you know?
Well, an elder brother had gotten hold of it and left it lying around the house. And it was literally as simple as that. But the other bit of serendipity was that when Graham came over to Dublin that time, he worked with the fencing team at Trinity College, the university in Dublin, where my sister was on part of the fencing club. And she said that was how I got to go to that event. So there was a lot of nonsense going on, if you like to believe in nonsense.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also think there was an earlier. I have on my desk a card that I sent to the headmaster of my secondary school, and I keep it there because because I have such love for the man, and I sent him a copy of Enabling Genius. But he was the headmaster and later the abbot of Glenstall Abbey, a Benedictine monastery, just outside Limerick in the south of Ireland. And it was there are some privileges which you have to acknowledge as just being an unwarranted gift. I studied there, and it was the most benign, nurturing organization you could possibly imagine. So there was something about the values, not the Catholicism, but there was something about the values, the appreciations of things artistic, the appreciation of the individual and their needs. So schooling was I heard a story about one of my friends who wasn't good at school. We knew him as Mixer, and he would just wander off. We had kind of 400 acres in the middle of the most beautiful part of Ireland. He would just wander off and not be seen for hours. And it would come a point where Celestine, the headmaster and soon to be abbot, would actually say, Mixer, or he would have called him Michael, of course. He said, Michael, you have to attend a little bit. So he just found you. But it was the most extraordinary environment. And I think that prepared me to be open to Tim's message.
Yeah, and given what you've written, I think in Enabling Genius, but maybe in Effective Modern Coaching as well, about the kind of, what should we say, what often happens in education systems in countries like the UK and the Republic of Ireland and the US and lots of parts of the world, that does sound like quite an extraordinary educational experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not that we weren't encouraged to pass exams, and it wasn't that there was absolutely no discipline in the place, but you were really encouraged to find your own way.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the Alexander Corporation and various other bits of that story that you've touched on already. But I'm just curious, like, The Inner Game of Tennis, right, is an influential book, and it's obviously influential on you. Do you think there's a reason why it was about tennis and not another sport? Was it just what Tim was interested in? Like, is there something special about tennis that made it the right sport for that book to be written about?
It's not so much special about tennis. It's just tennis has some unique characteristics. So first, Tim had been a very, very good tennis player. He was captain of the Harvard and Yale have a team that every number of years, it might be as many as every 4 years, and I don't even know if they still do this, but they had a tradition of a combined team going out and about and visiting strange places, not least Dublin on one occasion. Tim was captain of that. So what that tells you was that he probably had the raw ability to be top 100 in the world. So it was kind of, so tennis was, and I haven't played tennis against Tim. I have hit tennis balls with Tim on beautiful sunny days on grass courts in West London. So it's something that is part of both of our identities, undoubtedly. But tennis is the better answer to your question is that one, numbers of people have affinity with it because it's something that anybody can play. You just need one other person. You do need a tennis court, but it's not like other games where you have to get a side of 11 together, and so you can do it more spontaneously. But also it meant that it was quite accessible when Tim started doing workshops and things, because you can do your demonstration and still have the people watching be in close proximity. You can set it up so people can do exercises and try drills so that they have an experience of inner game rather than a theoretical presentation. So it's allowed people to engage in a way that through that physical experience and the actual learning, being immersed in it as Tim was there, that I think had probably more impact than sitting in front of your man Robbins and being shouted at. So I think that was those characteristics, I think, made it accessible and meaningful for people.
Yeah, I guess also there's something, if we think about as I'm thinking about, why is it that sport, allowed him to write that book, which I'm realizing that I haven't read it, but I feel like I have, because I've heard about it through your work, through other people's, which has so many, what would you call it, transferable characteristics from the ideas in the book, which come from the ideas about tennis to so many other places.
Yeah.
It's partly that it's one of the things that makes it such a great spectator sport for me. It's partly that it is the individuals, in that, obviously, when they're at their absolute best, the glory of the flow and the incredible skill, but it is the individuals. And so I guess that the self one, self two, which we could explain for people who don't know it, that distinction becomes, I guess, more apparent than in a game of, let's say, football, where you can afford one of the midfielders or the right back to be stuck in his criticism of himself some of the time, because the ball's not always there and it's not so noticeable, maybe to the untrained eye, at least, when he or she is.
Yeah. Eddie Jones may take exception to what but yes, I absolutely, I think that's correct. We can relate to it, and it's immediate.
Yeah. And so
I still take people on tennis courts.
Yeah, well, maybe now's the time, because one of the things I remembered it so clearly when I came back to the book. I wanted to find it. One of my favorite bits in effective modern coaching. Well, there's two of them. There may be more, but the two that I remember are the stories about both. I think it's like, I don't think it is you actually, the story where you tell it in effective modern coaching about the catching practice. Yes. So that story, but there is the story about you say this great thing about coaching golf. You give this example, and then you say there are two reasons why I don't give anyone any technical advice or instruction when I'm coaching golf. One is that it doesn't help with learning. The other is I don't know anything about golf. Yeah. But that comes after this amazing story. Maybe that's the one to go to. Just to give us this, give me and anyone who's listening that kind of idea of how that goes, because I guess it's jumping from you saying you still go on tennis courts with people, but it's like something amazing about those stories.
Well, yeah, and Gallwey's words were around that, where he had this set of words which just sticks with me, which he said, awareness is curative. So the very act of becoming more aware allows stuff to change. And what that means is that you've got to trust that process. You've got to be present to it, attend to it, and trust that the body will self-learn, self-correct, and make those adjustments. So when you're on a tennis court or a golf driving range, if you can simply notice whether on tennis, if the ball is going long or short, and you could then make a decision about where you want the ball to be on the court, and say kind of 3 feet before the baseline. That'd be a great length. Okay, great. So then what I would say as the coach is, I say, let's just mark it there with a couple of balls so we know where it is. And now I want you to forget about that as a target. You see, if I set that up as a target, you'll try to hit it and then you're fucked. But if I set it up as what I want you to do is I want you to tell me how much beyond that line you were, or how much short of it you were. That's all. That's all. I don't want you to try and hit it. I simply want you to tell me as accurately as you can where the ball lands in relation to that line we've just decided on. And the person will, they'll hit a ball and they'll say, 5 feet long, or whatever they say, whatever measurement system they use. Or next one was short, next one is longer. And what happens is that just by attending or not trying, suddenly they start hitting the line, or they get very much closer to it. And it's just, so the golf lesson takes the same approach, which is you establish what a good shot will look like by looking at the horizon and saying between that tree and that lamppost and about this distance. And you say, forget about that. And then you ask this question, which nobody can answer at first. And it is probably of two questions, one of the most powerful, which is what do you notice? So you don't just ask that intellectually. You say, hit some balls and tell me what you notice. And people find that difficult to answer at first because we're so trained to comply that they're looking for the right answer rather than looking for simply what it is they're noticing. Eventually, they start giving you some information. My hands on the club are uncomfortable. My left knee hurts. So they give you, and then as you listen and you keep asking the question, what else are you noticing? Hit some more. What else are you noticing? Don't let them process it intellectually. Just keep them in the action, noticing. Oh, my swing feels a little bit jerky. And then you probably summarize. So you've told me that your knee hurts, your right knee hurts, that the grip is a little bit uncomfortable, you feel a bit stiff, and that the swing is jerky. I want you to hit another few balls and tell me of all of those things, which is most interesting. And that's the second most useful question. And at that moment, and this is why the two questions work in tandem, is that in that moment, what you've done is you've brought them from a place where their attention is all over the fucking place to focused on one thing. And that's when the magic happens. When you're in that state, which Gallwey calls self two, you learn. And it's not you learn because some magic nonsense happened. You learn because you were wired to learn. That's how the human being developed. You learned to walk without being taught. That mechanism is still in your system. The wiring is still there. We neglect it, but we can reactivate it, fortunately. And my job is to reactivate it. And once they start getting that information, the remarkable thing happens is whatever's going on in their stroke begins to change. So they say, okay, the guy says, he chooses. What stands out is the slight jerkiness in the stroke. Okay, and then my question is to bring more attention to that. Nothing else. So what do you notice about that? And I get more information. And he gets more and more focused, or she gets more and more focused. And unbeknownst to them, because they're not paying attention to it, the external target starts to be achieved.
And that's the kind of like the extraordinary bit from the stories, like the reason they stuck with me for 6 years or whatever it is.
Yeah.
The reason that when we first confirmed this, I was like, the first question I'm going to have to ask him is, did that catching thing really happen? Because it's so extraordinary. And when I was reading back the catching story, which for listeners is like, it's the same process. I think it's one of your colleagues doing it. It's like, there's this moment where the guy who can't catch realizes what he's doing. And even in the way it's written in a book about a thing that probably happened years ago, like actually, this time when I was reading it, tears came into my eyes because it's just so amazing.
I know. You get tears come into your eyes every time something like that happens. And I've seen it so many thousands of times I couldn't possibly count. It still has that same powerful impact. It's just remarkable.
It's just
it's remarkable in contrast to the normal nonsense we have to put up with. The power relationships from teacher to child, the imposition of having to comply with other ways of people's doing things, which just totally inhibits self-expression. Now, we might get onto it later because obviously there's not just the learning that you do for yourself. There's that I'm still in training to be a competitive tennis player, and my coach gives me wonderful instructions. We've had conversations about how to do that effectively, and we work really well together after a while. So it's not that there isn't a place for instruction. It's just that the first port of call is the individual's ability to learn for themselves.
Yeah. And I mean, in some ways, those two questions that you've given us in this part, they're the thing that I, returning to your work and watching you coach and reading the book again, the Effective Modern Coaching, it was like, that thing, it's such a beautiful, gentle way to work with a client in a conversation or a player. Maybe we should do that distinction of yours too. Yeah. So just for anyone listening, it's like everything we've just talked about in the story, whether it's the tennis coaching or the golf coaching or the catching example, is all incredibly beautifully replicable in a conversation with anyone about anything. And that's essentially, and that's and it's a very interesting way to have a conversation. It's really amazing.
Yeah, very powerful.
Yeah, and
it contains. I've been kind of saying some things about words like compliant. There are, some people really struggle. It is blindingly, literally blindingly simple. It's so simple that people don't see it because they're clouded in their own thinking about ego-driven stuff, about trying to solve the problem for the person, about being seen as the coach, about their own curiosity getting in the way, all kinds of things. Need for control. If the person goes off in that way of thinking, which I don't sanction, what's going to happen? So I've had people in trainings with me who, when they suddenly get how simple it is, they actually get angry because their coaching has all been driven by the fact that they are deeply empathetic, and they can see what's going on for other people, and they can provide solutions and answers, and they've invested in that. It's become part of their identity, and it's incredibly difficult to give up on it. And what has to happen, of course, is for them to work out, but they don't have to give up on that part. They just might be better served by doing this other thing, helping the other person think it through for themselves first. And then, if required, those other capacities are useful, unbelievably useful.
Yeah, but maybe just to slow down on it, I suspect lots of people listening will kind of have the sense of this, but for you, why is it so important that having the other person think for themselves, inviting them to do that through those kind of questions, through the following interest, why is it so important that happens first?
There are two answers to that, one of which is deeply personal. And just in my own life experience, there have been so many occasions where either one of two things have happened. Either somebody has let me explore and do something on my own, and I've experienced the joy of that self-expression. And if I don't know if I'm going to say this very well because it's not entirely 100% thought through, but I think that one of the joys and gifts of being a human being, and maybe even something close to the duties or responsibilities, is to express yourself in life. And that I'm hesitant about that because it's such a big call, but that's so vital, and that's where extraordinary things happen to you and to others. And the other side of that was those moments where somebody hasn't let me do that, and the appalling sense of being constricted. So that sense of being contained and constricted, I rebel against very quickly, which doesn't always make me a great colleague. Enough of that. But the other reason is that I was coaching a guy, and I remember his first name, but he's not his second name, Philip. He was the HR director for United Distillers, which is the company that owned Guinness and are now called something else entirely. And it's not Diageo, but this was when they were United Distillers. A lovely, very bright man, and it wasn't really a coaching relationship, but there was some of that going on. but we were talking about some of the things that the business at that point, the Alexander Corporation, was doing within United Distillers, and he was trying to get his head around the whole coaching thing, and it was buried in a conversation around creativity. And when he understood what coaching was, he said, so this isn't about creativity and innovation in that big sense. It's about having all of those people that get coached be tiny little centers, sparks of innovation, of creativity, because you release their potential, to use a trite phrase. And so, but you could just see the light went on. So I think that's, if I'm playing a bigger game at all, that's what excites me. It's that when each and every person can find the confidence, the desire, the will, the whatever it takes for them to express themselves, the collective impact of that, the ripples, the word we used earlier, it's just enormous. It's just simply enormous. And I've seen it happen so many times that it's that you mentioned tears coming to the eyes. That's what it is. It's like seeing somebody flourish in that way.
It sounds like for you, probably, and probably it's true for me as well, there's like a personal side of why that so captures the imagination, the soul, whatever it is.
Yes, the experience in the school that I mentioned earlier had both of those things, those glorious moments where, when before we had in Ireland in those days, we had something called the Leaving Certificate, which was the equivalent of an A-level exam. The night before I was due to do my maths exam, I was out on the tennis court hitting tennis balls. It's like that, and nobody would have said a word if in fact, I probably would have been encouraged. And they would have found a good reason why Myles would have been. So in any other environment, you'd have had the ass kicked. It's like, what the hell are you doing? Why aren't you doing a last minute study? Why aren't you saying your prayers? it's like, so I had that glorious experience, but I equally had moments where people tried to get me to do things their way. And so it's like when you've tasted one, the other becomes even more bitter.
Yeah. For me, it was, I was home educated until I was 9. And so I had I had a particular parents who were able to do that for all kinds of reasons, able not only in the kind of practical sense, but able in like willing, and also able to create something quite special, at least for me, through doing that. And then in the end, I went to school and I came up against some slightly different, let's say, ways of inviting and encouraging learning, which was one of, still think of, really for me, it was one of the absolute formative moments of my life, was going from one environment into the other through let's say, probably 3-4 year adjustment period before I kind of found the ways to flourish more in that environment. So I can kind of feel what you're saying personally. I guess what's interesting, and I'm just aware that it might be because if we both have an experience like that, of course, we're then both interested in some of the things you've written about the shift that the world might be going through, about the other the other education systems, or the other parts of the education system, not like the place you were in, but the ones which are more, and you talk about, taking the production line to its extreme conclusion in education, but also in workplaces, and the difference between what might be coming next. I'm just aware, sorry, I was going to ask about that, and I'm suddenly aware now, how, wondering how much of that is, we're both, I'm very interested in that too. And that's partly, I'm sure, because of the experiences that we've had. But I can tell from what you've written that, there's again, if we think about that bigger game you're just talking about, that higher level thing, there's societal ripples, again, for a better phrase, of what has happened in the way our institutions are arranged, and what could happen if it was more about helping people find that spark of creativity and self-expression.
Yeah.
I just wonder, as I've said all that, which isn't really a question, what are you noticing and what comes up for you?
Well, two things. What's clear, if we just stick with the world of work for the moment, is that the principles that drove us from over the last century, which are essentially around efficiency, from Henry Ford and his line to total quality management, right through to Six Sigma, where you can expect, in a production process, one error in every 6 million initiatives or items of production. That isn't very brilliantly expressed, but it's of that order. So we know how to do innovation, or not innovation, efficiency. But we've kind of run to the end of that, and we're still needing to be more productive and better margins and all of those good things. And we're starting to look to other places, and we're starting to look to how do we have the human itself bring more of that in. And you get into the world of things like agile, which is a big word. A lot of the big consultancies are out there doing programs around agile. And one line has been to manage people even more closely. So, so the expectation is that you will do this today to this standard, and you get the instruction in the morning. And these are highly intelligent people in a manufacturing plant. And you run this process, and tomorrow we'll tell you what the next one is. So it's actually, so one part of it has been to screw the thing down even tighter. And then you get inside. So two organizations have always intrigued me. One of which is the military. The military kind of invented command and control. And of course, what they found is that it doesn't work. When you get detached from, one, it's too unwieldy in terms of decision making. And when you get detached from whatever the center of command is, and you've been bred to compliance, you're dead, literally. So Genghis Khan learned this. He completely destroyed kind of European people sitting in half a ton of armor on top of a horse that carried another half a ton of armor. He came in with agility. Good God, his soldiers, his mates were wearing leather jerkins that only covered the front. They didn't cover the back because they weren't going to run away. It's like just the level of thinking and his speed, all of that was just, and then that similar thing became blitzkrieg. The United States became very interested in how the Germans did that blitzkrieg and took vast territories so very quickly. So they moved to a thing called mission command. Mission command says that what you have to do is, one, trust your team. You have to have a very clear vision that's shared amongst all the operatives within that team. And you decentralize leadership. So you align people, and then you enable them. So you move from command and control to align and enable. You look at startups, right? Startups are another type of organization like the military, where performance is key. In the military, performance is key because lives are expensive, and the population in general are more averse to war than they've ever been. Militaries, on startups, you're burning somebody else's money, and I know because I'm in one. The imperative for performance is just huge. So there's a whole different sense of some people have learned how to do that. Entrepreneurial mindset, you might call it. And for instance, one of the things about that is about making sure that everybody knows what the current primary business objective is. And a good leader will go around their team and say, how does what you're doing contribute towards the primary business objective? And if it doesn't, do something else. And we've moved into a place that align and enable, where you make sure people are clear about what they need to do, they're aligned, and aligned not just practically, but aligned in terms of purpose and meaning as well. So the vision of the startup has meaning for each individual person. And the enable piece is the coaching piece. So I see a tension between those two things. And I know which one I hope would win, but I'm not convinced it will, because if I've been speaking for too long without interruption, just let me throw one more thing into the mix, and because this is the nub of it. There have been a number of occasions, far too many for real comfort, where I'm working in an organization and making some difference, either directly as a coach or in the past with the School of Coaching, where we're training managers to align and enable, essentially. And I then bump into the chief executive, there are certain chief executive, I come in the door and we just, it's just easy. We've done it. And there's another type, which I come in the door and something in their makeup just puts them on their guard when Myles Downey walks in. Because my desire that people should express themselves, be themselves, think for themselves, question, all of those things is anathema. They just do not want that in their organization because they're the daddy. They're in control, and that's the way it's going to be. And statistically, we know that there are something like 4 times as many sociopaths at senior level in management than there are in the general population. It's like, whoa, I'm surprised. So there's a huge battle between love and will, basically. Love, nurturing, enabling, trusting, will, controlling.
Yeah, and is that I can see for anyone who's watching, we'll put the video of this out at some point, probably not as soon as the audio. Over your shoulder is, I think, a love, will, and something triangle.
So a guy, shall I explain that?
Yeah, that'd be great.
So there are about 3 or 4 places I go to for inspiration. One of which is George Kelly and personal construct theory. Another is obviously Tim Gallwey. And a third is Roberto Assagioli, who was the guy who created, with others, but it was the central figure in psychosynthesis. It's a wonderful discipline. And wonderful because some of his thinking is so clear, wonderful because in there he has ways of using the imagination and one's creativity in terms of how he trains his therapists. So he's long dead now, of course, but his spirit still exists. One of his models he called Love and Will, and one of his books, I think his second book, was An Act of Will, and he talks about love and will as 2 fundamental human drives. And so love is he would say it's a feminine energy, not saying that that's the exclusive preserve of women folk, but it has that quality. It's about trust, it's about the process, it's about letting things happen. Will is a more masculine energy, it's much more focused, it's much more controlling, it's much more about structure, less tolerant, where tolerant doesn't have a value judgment on it. And clearly love and will have good and bad things about them. So that nurturing is obviously good, but an overly nurturing parent, if you say, oh, poor Johnny comes out of school and he's a bit upset and something's happened, and a parent says, oh, poor Johnny, poor Johnny, don't worry, mummy or daddy will fix it. I'll have a word with the teacher. Whoa, he's going to get beaten up because of that. But not only that, is you've robbed that person, you've robbed little Johnny of the opportunity to take responsibility for their own situation. So overly nurturing is dangerous. Equally, if you don't provide boundaries, if not enough will is not a good thing. The child doesn't know how to fit in. And too much will becomes bullying. Again, you rob the child of the responsibility one more time. But what Assagioli did was utterly brilliant. And from somebody else's use of language, said that anytime you've got 2 things in kind of opposition like that, love and will, it's important to remember it's not a spectrum between the 2. He said that what you do is you transcend and include. Transcend, you go up a level of abstraction, and include means you embrace both love and will. So at the top of the triangle that you can see on the whiteboard behind me is the word, Assagioli had the word presence. So you have love and will on the baseline of the triangle, on the 2 corners, and on the 3rd corner, you have presence. And what presence I put the word wisdom there because in my mentality, that just it tells me more about what I can do. But it's about taking a perspective of a situation, understanding it, understanding the context, and from that position of being present and of wisdom, of being able to take an approach that's appropriate to the circumstances, which may include love or will, or maybe something else. But that was that, and it's such a brilliant notion because if you take those 3 things and you put them into the coaching relationship, the The wisdom piece is when maybe as the coach you take a lead. The will piece is where you set goals with people that you then, if they're an employee of an organization, you get the organization to sanction and sign off, right? So now you've got some structure around it. And then the love piece, the nurturing piece, is the coaching, where you help them think through how they're going to do it. So it fits into a model that comes, that's called lead, manage, coach, which is I discovered recently that only 71% of people who are given a job managing others within corporates, that 71% of those people aren't trained, are not trained. You're managing these other people. Your job is to lead, manage, coach them, and you've no training. It's like sending teachers into a school without training them first. It's just daft. 71% of people in this country, given their first job, aren't trained to do it.
That's amazing. And I probably lots of people are like this, but certainly when I first was training coaching skills, that one of the first things I thought was, oh shit, I really could have done with this when I managed people. I would have been like, so much better. Of course, that in how I manage people was the spark of what I bring to coaching, but it was very aware of that. So many places we could follow interest here, Myles, but the one that I'm interested in first is, I think there was a reference to Ken Wilber in what you just said. Is that right?
I didn't use his name, but you detected, yes, Transcend. And there are some things about, I think Wilber comes from a kind of a fairly will-led school.
Yeah.
I've worked with consultants who follow that kind of methodology. And it tracks back to a guy called Werner Erhard, who was a bit of a genius and a bit of a demon. And he ran a cult, basically.
Right.
And it wasn't always nice. He had some good intentions, but yes. So it's more about getting people to the right answers. It's more about nudging people and showing them the way than it is about helping people find out for themselves. So I've got some suspicion about Ken Wilber, but I think some of his writing is revelatory.
And maybe that in particular. So for people, I can say a little bit. So the interesting thing for me, when I read Effective Modern Coaching, one of the interesting things for me was that you reference one of Wilber's books in the back. In fact, the only one that I've read. But my dad and my older brother were really interested in Wilber, I guess, as at the kind of height of maybe the kind of end/height of the integral movement's biggest popularity. But I could kind of feel a bit of his influence. I thought maybe when I was reading the start of Enabling Genius too, it felt like there's an attempt to take this enormous issue of how we might enable people to find that genius, and we can maybe talk about the word in a little bit, to try and take a look at the whole picture, and then bring together in one place some of something that some of the things in common that are had across all the ways that people have looked at performance. And so it's really nice to, I remember when one of the things that brought me to coaching round and about was I'd kind of, my brother made an interview series called Waking Up the Workplace, which was where he pulled together, it was like an online thing where before online, before like online summits were a thing. Almost before that, or before I knew about them anyway, maybe coming a little bit late, they pulled together a bunch of people, and they were often people who were really influenced by Wilber and the integral movement, but who had taken it and made it more practical in the world. And I hadn't really found a connection to that directly in coaching. So it had been part of the spark for me of, okay, there's a different way to think about business. There's a different way to think about the world where we're doing both. We're both being really effective, and maybe it's some of that masculine feminine dynamic again. We're both being really effective, like as effective as possible, and we're here to do good. We're here to bring love. We're here to help people flourish. And I'd never really seen both of those things in one place, so it's very exciting. And I remember reading the book and coming to that thing coming to the reference to brief history, everything in the end of that book, and thinking, oh, this is exciting. This is some of that stuff coming together for me. So it sounds like some of the ideas of Wilber have been really interesting for you and valuable.
So and I think this is for those people who are coaches listening as well. And I thank you for listening. one of his notions struck me more than any other, or stayed with me, I think is at least consciously, was he speaks about that, everything has an inner and an outer, an interior and an exterior. And that kind of rings true, that there's, that on the interior, we have our beliefs, our mindset, our values, all of those things. And on the exterior, we have skills and behaviors and ways of doing things. And the first time I saw that, I can remember distinctly a colleague drawing a line down the middle of a page, a vertical line, and writing interior, exterior on either side of the line. And of course, I went to, oh, that's interesting. Tim's inner game implies an outer game. Okay, fair enough. So I could see that piece. And then horizontally across the middle of the page, he drew another line. And he then making 4 quadrants. And above the line, you have the individual, and below the line, you have the collective. So one and many. So you have the interior life of an individual. So people like Freud were intrigued by the interior life of an individual. You have the exterior life of an individual, behaviorists, Skinner and his pigeons, and nudging and training people, and carrot and stick. Below the line, then you have the interior life of a collective, common values, those kinds of things, and the exterior life, the processes by which we manage ourselves, the agreements we make. So what begins to come to life is a lens through which you can look at an organization. And this is relevant for us as coaches, because I think one of the failures and not in every case, obviously, so one of the potential failures of coaching, if I put it like that, is that we become overly believing in what the person in front of us is saying. And we simply help that person on their journey, which is a great thing to do. But if part of their journey is to thrive in their current business, we're not necessarily doing them a service, and we may not be doing the people around them a service. So I hold it very strongly that one of my responsibility as a coach, as a halfway decent coach, is to be the best consultant I can be. It's not that that's particularly my gift, but I attend to it and do my best, because I'm trying to make sure that whatever amounts from the coaching equates to a result for the individual and for the person paying the bills. And it's that's one of the reasons I make a distinction between the client, they're paying the bills, and the person I call the player, because I need to keep that separate in my mind. And I just like the word player too, because it has that notion of creativity, of play, of expression. And it also has the suffix ER at the end, which is not EE. So divorcee, you have been divorced. You are at the end of something. Whereas if you have the ER, then you are the actor. And so putting the player in that seat seems to be important. So there's that going on. But so that was one idea that came from Wilbur that allowed me to crystallize and bring together some of those disparate things from personal construct theory, from Tim's inner game, and actually then bring them into play as a way of thinking about the individual in their organization. Because with those 4 quadrants, whatever happens in one quadrant will show up in the others. So if your chief executive said, we're going to change the culture, and makes a decree that everybody should, and then doesn't change his own behavior, whatever systems, whatever communications he puts in place, she puts in place, they ain't going to work.
Yeah. Yeah, such a great framework. And the other one that which brought us into this conversation is that idea. The other one for me that really stands out is that just idea of transcend and include, and
yes,
shows up in so many ways. But it's often a real relief to people, I think, when you hear that's if you can share with somebody that probably how things develop is they transcend and include is a massive relief. I don't have to leave behind everything from before. I'm going to just grow a little and include that and be more.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, Yeah.
It goes back to Einstein. A problem was never solved at the level of consciousness at which it was created. So move up a level, you get a different perspective.
Yeah.
Transcend and include.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so many places we could go from here, but actually I do want to rewind a little bit. It kind of, when you were talking about being the best consultant as well as the best coach, I mean, there's so many places we could go from there, but I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more in terms of your journey about, how it came that you, obviously there's this kind of serendipity, but that transition into the Alexander Corporation and alongside the inner game coaching, and kind of where that took you in your journey, that because there's a lot in your career, a lot of different places we could go. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the kind of foundations of that in that period, because I think, is this right? Again, I think I've read you say probably in one of the books that you are the slightly rare thing of someone who's been coaching in the way we talk about it pretty much their whole career.
Yeah. So I as I said, I studied architecture. I worked for about a year in an architect's office. As the newcomer, you get the desk by the door because it's probably the least comfortable. And I could see that kind of 15, 20 desks away from me in the other corner of the drawing office, there was the managing partner who was probably somewhere between 35 and 40. And I'm looking at the desk and saying, okay, so that's the expectation, is that Myles will go from this desk to that desk and eventually end up in that one. I thought, that's going to take a while. And it became quite clear then, studying the inner game and meeting some extraordinary people. Graham Alexander, who set up the Alexander Corporation, a guy called Alan Fine, who went to the States ultimately, who was the inner game coach who initially trained me. He was a great tennis player. And he set up Inside Out in the States. And of course, the wonderful Sir John Whitmore. And I was around those and a few others, Ben Cannon not least. And we were, and it was a wonderful time. I was 27, 28. My first client was McKinsey. For those of you who don't know who McKinsey are, they are the world's preeminent management consultancy, and they became very, very interested in what we were doing, and invited us in. And as a 28-year-old who knows nothing, I got this great gift. It was the most extraordinary gift. They put me for about 10 days on a kind of a fairly informal and impromptu training program, which was designed to help me understand the history and the practices of McKinsey. And the purpose of doing it was that coming in with the message that we were coming in was that we wouldn't get rejected by the organization, and that we'd be able to manage our way around those things, bringing in this slightly different message. And McKinsey, I'm mostly pleased to say, have been a client ever since then. And I've worked for them all over the world. I addressed their 2008 Partners Conference, and various other things. So they've been really big, but it gave me a really important understanding that what I was, it's where the idea of being a good consultant came from. And they also, the professionalism that goes with that, the rigor that goes with that, the restlessness that goes with that was all part of that learning, and a wonderful blessing. I got to the point within the Alexander Corporation where there was kind of nowhere for me to go. The business was of a certain size. I was beginning to get my own ideas, and it became time for me to, as gracefully as one can when those kinds of relationships begin to crumble a little, the danger is that they get emotional. We made sure that didn't happen, and I went and set out on my own. And within a couple of years, I had taken responsibility internally for the training of new coaches. So I was beginning to form an idea about how you do that most effectively, and that led to the formation of the School of Coaching. And I think that was in. I'll pause after this because we probably need to draw breath, you or me, or maybe anybody who's still listening. The wonder of it all I be clear, there were plans and there were intentions, but things happened that I couldn't have designed or planned or predicted. The most extraordinary thing about the School of Coaching for me personally, well, there was lots of things, but the people I met, the work we did, the ripples we created, it was just wonderful fun. Not always, but for most of it, and really great people on the team. But in terms of my kind of what I was becoming, I was coaching, and I was teaching coaching. Now, so that meant that the distinction as I were making were being tested in the heat of battle the next day. Also, as somebody who was teaching coaching, I think I probably demonstrated more coaching than anybody in the world, and I say that without a smile. I think that's probably true. I have sat in front of so many people, thousands of times, giving a 15-minute demonstration of coaching. So that's a pretty the white heat of battle. Boy, do you learn. So you make your mistakes, you get the feedback. So I've got more feedback than anybody else. I mean, I really, really have. I've so much feedback, not all useful, but most of it tells you something. And then I had the opportunity to write the first book on coaching, all around about a 5-year period. And of course, because I've been teaching it was more than 5 years, but it doesn't matter. I wrote that first book in 3-4 day weekends. And it's like, I don't say that kind of out of pride or ego. It was just that everything had been distilled and practiced, and it was what I was teaching. And it came out almost like a stream of consciousness. I don't think I edited any of it. It just went down on paper and to the publisher. And it was those three things that allowed me, I think, to make some really clear distinctions in and around what I was teaching and what I was doing, that saw a leap in the quality of what we were doing as coaches, but also of how we were teaching.
Yeah, and I mean, those things, all of them, each of them alone would be enough to help somebody, clarify their thinking, understand what's going on. But the three of them together, and if they happened in that, 5 years or so,
yeah,
then yeah, because it is something, Myles, that comes across in I haven't read the original Effective Coaching, but I've read the Effective Modern Coaching, and I've seen you talk about other things.
There's a lot of overlap. It's 50% the same.
Yeah, but it's like it kind of, how can I put this? When I'm reading it, I can tell that it's not quite created independently, but it's like that it comes from, it doesn't come from someone reading the ICF stuff and then creating their own way of, sorry, say again.
Not much does.
But it's like sometimes when you read something about coaching, it feels like it's based on something you've already seen, but there's so many nice parts of the way that you speak about coaching that, at least for me, feel like they've been developed independently in some way. And what I imagine that is this thing you've just said, the white heat of battle with those thousands of demos. It's like you're gonna get clear after a while on, okay, what happens? And if I only have to do one thing here, what do I do? And what's the most, what's the most interesting or important way for me to show this, and all that kind of thing. So I think that comes across, and it also touches, I guess, on the genius piece, which is that, those perhaps too oft trotted out stories about 10,000 hours, which isn't, now isn't quite what it was, and all that kind of thing. But like the deliberate practice, that was definitely happening through all those things, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And so just say, if you don't mind, say a little bit more about the School of Coaching as an organization, both kind of who were you training, how did that develop, and then in the end you brought your involvement in the organization to a close in a couple of different ways as that evolved and emerged on. I'm just curious to hear a bit more about that.
I think I was clear right from the beginning that I was not to be the manager of the school. That was not the role that I should take.
And how did you know that, or why were you clear on that?
Because I can't add. I think what I've learned is that I wasn't then, and probably, although things have changed and I've worked on it, is I'm not as commercial as some people around me, maybe to my detriment. So my interests were more driven by the principles, the mission, and I needed somebody beside me who was strong to balance that and provide the business management framework that would make us successful. And for many, many years, we had a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful lady, Trisha Bay, who came out of Deloitte Consulting as the managing director. And in those days, we thrived, absolutely thrived, and growing slowly but steadily. And then it was there was a good relationship between herself and myself, and a really good team. And she had the wisdom and perspective to know when she should lead and push, and when to let me do the other side of the business, which was kind of not managing the faculty, but keeping the faculty true to what we were teaching. There was a constant battle where people wanted to bring in their own models and their own ideas, and what you ended up was with an agenda that we were teaching, which became more and more crowded. And my job was always to strip it back and say, no, this is the essence. This is what we teach. And so that kind of leadership. And then it got to a point where the business was beginning to be hit by the fallout from the crash in 2008 and the 9/11 scenario, and we were struggling to make it work. It was still working, but not well enough. And J&J Associates, a small consultancy that has global reach, who specialize in safety and what they would call incident and injury free. So it goes back to our friend Wilbur, an approach to safety on construction sites and oil fields, where the deep intent, profound intent, is that nobody should get hurt, which is different. Listeners may be surprised to hear from what most health and safety is about, which is about adhering to rules. I sold the business to them, and that was healthy for a while. But then I realized that I needed to spread my wings again, and moved on. And the school is in their hands.
And so it's now presumably running. Is it running training for people in those industries? Was it always primarily for training in was it public facing, or was it always mainly for training managers in coaching and people in organizations?
No, it wasn't. So we did run open programs for individuals to come up to, but that wasn't what really happened. Was that the methodology got absorbed into the bigger J&J business, and those people who were on the team who stayed got absorbed into the business. So what the outcome, if you like, is that they now run really, really powerful programs for what in the past we would have called health and safety supervisors, who are now health and safety coaches. And I was there for the initial part of that transition, and it was remarkable to see people who were not well respected on site, the health and safety guys, or the safety supervisors. People would run from them if they saw them coming. And the conversation,
and kind of with good reason. Like I don't know about the individuals, but it's like that's the kind of, because mostly the health and safety supervisor is there to tell you off for doing something you shouldn't be doing, but probably inside you think their kind of job's worth because the rule that they're following doesn't feel like it affects the real life. I'm trying to,
exactly.
internalizing a bit, but when you said health and safety coaches, It's like, that is different, right?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, and the health and safety guy who has no authority, is trying to find ways of telling people how to, so it just doesn't dynamically, it just doesn't work. But when the safety supervisor learns to come alongside the operative on site, and work through with them what might be difficult about a given situation and what the options were, it's a completely different adult to adult conversation. Utterly transformative, utterly. So that was it wasn't all a good thing leaving the school like that, but I did need to go on and do other things, and I didn't want to get integrated into a very good business, but it wasn't for me. So yeah, it left all that material in a pretty good place.
Yeah, and if you like, and maybe it's those questions we talked about and the following interest piece that we kind of hinted at, but if you were to think about that those ideas that you developed, particularly perhaps in that 5-year period, but that then got refined after that, which are the most interesting? I was going to say important, right? But it's like, I'm aware of your distinction between asking about important and interesting, but which are either the most important or the most interesting of those ideas?
From the School of Coaching, from that body of work?
Yeah. Hello to my daughter Leah, if anyone can hear her in the background. She's having a moment.
What's her name?
Leah.
Yeah, lovely.
Yeah.
Hello, Leah. I'm not sure how well I can answer the question. I think the thing the thing that comes to mind is goes back to that deliberate practice thing. I was part of a Facebook group a long time ago, and then I got off Facebook completely. And there was I think it was an ICF group or something like that, and there was a conversation about coaching and techniques and standards and whatever else. And some guy from the States writes in and says, "Well, I tried that questioning thing and it didn't work." I kind of, oh my God. So I wrote back and said, "Oh, mate, very good. Have you had any training?" No. Well, it's like, so what for me, coaching is, by the dictionary definition, it's a craft is something that's done with the hands. And although the hands can be important in coaching, it isn't the primary tool. But I think of coaching very much as a craft. And all of what I've tried to write about and teach is not about theory or standards or ethics, or anything like that, because frankly, they don't help. What people need to know is how to do it well. And so thinking about it in terms of a craft, and a craft that's something that you don't learn once, and then you've got it. You continually nurture through your lifetime in that profession, and maybe beyond. So I think the important thing for me that comes out of those things was to understand, at least in my terminology, that coaching is a craft, and that you continue to get better at it. And that once you learn I am a better coach this year by some margin than I was 5 years ago. And that's about learning some kind of higher level things about how to trust my intuition, how to, some of those things are quite technical as well. But and that's what's important, is that you never stop learning, and that you need to have a respect for your craft. And I think that focus on the craft and in the books, it's all about how to do it. There's a little bit of kind of inner game theory, but that kind of, or whatever, or I might spin off occasionally. But essentially, and that's why the stories are there. They're trying to give you a picture of, oh, that's what it looks like when somebody's doing it, and that's the attempt, at any rate, to communicate it. So I think that's the best answer I can give you, certainly at the moment.
Yeah, it's great. It's great, Myles. And yeah, I guess before, I've got another question for you about this kind of period and coaching more generally, but I'm curious, so what you've been learning recently is just such an interesting thing to think about. So yeah, in the last 5 years, you said it's like you're notably a better coach, or you feel like that. Some is about trusting intuition. What are the other things that you're seeing in your coaching, as a craftsman, that are developing or have been important recently?
I put together a project team to look at the whole area of genius, of potential. And genius is merely another way of saying, well, no, it's a bit more than just another way of saying potential, because it puts your potential within your grasp.
I think that's an amazing paragraph or two in the book Enabling Genius about the word genius versus the word potential versus what's the being your best self.
Oh yeah, give me a break.
So you got to say more about that. Sorry, we brought that in. You have to explain that a bit more.
Well, it's like what that opens yourself up to the excuse, which is in a compliant society, and we are complicit in our compliance. Well, my best self just wasn't good enough. It's like, oh, well, okay, fine. It's like you're letting yourself off the hook before you've even started. When you say, I did speak at a conference for the ICFF in Malmo a few years ago, and there was one of those guys who wears a blazer with the kind of the brassy gold buttons. And what that's telling you is I'm an important person. I have status in my bowling club or whatever it is. And this guy spluttering came up after me. I mean, he was almost in a rage, and he said, you can't say everybody's a genius. I said, oh, okay, why not? Well, and he gave some reasons. So I said, okay, so let's slow down a bit. Does everybody have potential? He said, yes, of course. So I said, okay, that's good. So, yeah, well, of course they do. I'm a coach. Of course they have potential. Right. Okay. That's. I kind of guessed you'd say that. So they have potential, but it's capped just short of genius. Is that what you're telling me? And the guy just looked at me in the eyes and said, and you could see him go, oh fuck, inside, because trapped in his cup. But he had the grace to say, I need to think about that.
Yeah, but credit to him, because it sounds like
absolutely.
You've really shown him a flaw in the thinking.
Yeah. So the purpose, one of the purposes of the Enabling Genius book was I noticed that some people I was working with were making a request of me then to go beyond my more habitual approach to coaching. That whole thing of kind of the non-directive, a term I don't like, following interest, helping them do the thinking. But I realized that to go there, I had to have some structure that would allow me to go there safely and responsibly, and not just to go there as a function of some bloody whim I had. So we with the team, we did some research, and you're right, we tried to condense it into something that was meaningful. So what's been happening since that book was published, I've been involved in a mobile learning platform, which I intimated earlier. And that's kind of been a great thing, but it's been 4 years of time when I've devoted 2/3 of my time to that. So there's been less coaching. But what the coaching that I have been doing had more attention, because there's less of it going on. So I tend to think about it a bit more. It has a little bit more, I have a little more distance from it. So there are a number of things. Technically, Enabling Genius allows me to do things that a kind of normal following interest wouldn't allow me to do. So for instance, I have a conversation with people very early on, almost always, about what I would call their direction of travel. And a direction of travel is a gentle way of encapsulating everything from my sense of purpose to where I want to be in 5 years' time, or whatever this is, to vision, to all of those things. So it's a kind of it's not a strong masculine will thing. These are my goals. It's got a more feminine energy to it. It's more about these are my desires and my interests. But if I know that about another person, and it's, when we worked on it and it's clear, I could help them make really great decisions about whether the next decision they're making or step they're taking is going to take them closer to or away from their direction of travel. It also puts me in a place where I can challenge more quickly. So what I'm finding is that because I no longer think about my technique, I don't need to, it's been sublimated. I've got more attention on the person that I'm working with. And I think I see what's emergent in them long before they do. And that's a terribly dangerous thing to say. I'm completely aware of that. But I can do that profound thing of listening intently and understanding and summarizing precisely so that somebody hears and sees what they're thinking. But then I can also put spin on something. I had a wonderful situation where a lady who I'd helped get herself out of a bad situation in a private equity business. and her direction of travel was about setting up a business in private equity that she was the leader of, the founder of, the person who formed and shaped it. She knew that later on she might have to move out of that particular role, let somebody in as an operations director or something, but that was the idea. And it would use technology. So wonderful, beautiful, integrated direction of travel. And she told me also, but as en passant at some time, that her brother was, highly respected, highly intelligent, slightly maverick character, again in the world of finance. And she looked up to this person and whatever else. And one day she rings me up and said, Myles, I've just had a conversation with my brother. It's really exciting. He wants to come and join the business. I said, no, on no account. And she said, what? Because that's not what you expect from your coach.
Yeah.
No account. What? I said, remember your direction of travel? She said, yes. I said, right. You and only you right now hold the vision and need to form it and make it real. And that's what your intent is. Yes. And you could see her just kind of go, oh, because if she worked it out, if the brother came in, he'd take over. He was older, too much respect, the dynamics, blah. It was a lot. So it's like, so what I find is that it actually comes from a place from a more profound understanding, I like to think. But I've got things that allow me, so that the enabling genius model says that there are a number of things that are critical: identity, desire, mindset, and they overlap in the center with learning and development. So identity is an understanding of who you are. There's a wonderful American tennis player who he has a physique that one might it's about 6'8" or something, maybe even more, with a big kind of beard that you might find from somebody who cuts down trees. And he's got a very strange, he's profoundly thoughtful. And he was talking about his favorite clothes designer, which was kind of a bit of a surprise in the first place. And he said, she knows what her identity is. And she said, it's the same for a tennis player. You have to know your identity, because that dictates how you play the game, how you practice, what you develop, which is what enabling genius is about. So that idea of having a clarity about your identity, your core identity perhaps, but also your identity as a coach, if that's slightly different, your identity as a leader. So identity, really, really important. That's the basis on which you interact with others, how they perceive you, how you grow and develop. And if it's not there, you don't know what your tactics are. If you don't understand who you are as a presenter, what do you do next? It's like you do what somebody else did. Well, it's not going to work. Desire is about a kind of, it's love and will. It's a feminized version of motivation. Mindset is about understanding what it is that drives you, and what are the components, the values and principles that are about your mindset. And then the learning is in the middle, because because all of those things are capable of changing. Your identity is capable of changing as you pass through the years, and you're capable of making them all stronger. So I now have in early years education, they use the word scaffolding, and so a scaffold is a shape in which something else gets built. So I've now got a scaffolding that gives me and my players security. I guess I almost said clients. And it gives us that security that we're going somewhere safely, and that it will take you somewhere. And what that in turn has done, one of the remarkable things that seems to happen is that as you clarify those things, identity, desire, mindset, you tend to increase the moments of flow in your life. So when I'm coaching on a good day, I'm as completely in flow as I can be. And what flow gives me is access to all my resources, my intelligence, such as it is, my creativity, such as it is, my imagination, my empathy, my ability to formulate stuff and say it, my awareness of where people are in their own mental state in that moment. And I literally, most of the time, don't know what I'm going to say next. And because I hold this thing as a craft, the gift of that is that that's where you end up. You think of a master craftsperson, hate the word master, but that's the word we use, huddled over a lathe or something, totally in tune with their piece of wood and creating something in that moment. And for me, it's the same thing.
And there's something about, it's not quite as obvious, I don't think, with the, I'm not sure I can do it in the craftsman metaphor, but in coaching, I think that thing you said about I sometimes see it before they do, or way before they do, and that feels like a risky thing to say in coaching. I think it's like probably the third, I only know probably 3 Ken Wilber ideas, but it's like, I haven't read a book about this one, so I don't know if I'm going to get it right, but in a way it's another Ken Wilber idea, or at least I heard it from that, which is, I think, the pre-trans fallacy. So it's like that 2 things can look the same at different levels of development, but that doesn't make them the same. And a beginner who said to your client, who said, no chance you're letting that person into the business, were just coming from their own thought and their ego and all those other things. That's really different to you with all the scaffold of enabling genius, with all the thinking that came out of the School of Coaching, totally in flow, knowing that no is the right thing to do. And that, I just think it's worth saying that, because sometimes it's a really tricky thing when you're starting out as a coach, because you learn the frameworks, like you have to learn and know the rules so that you can know when to break them. And often if you watch like really experienced coaches, they break the rules. And I think one of the reasons is that thing that I've just said, that I think you kind of told through the story you just told. Yeah,
and core to all of that, because I think there's more available to the kind of the apprentice coach, to use a craftsperson model, than they might otherwise believe. So if you can, if you understand what your intent is, and that also comes back to your identity when you're coaching, then that begins to free you up. See, if your intent is to help people, solve people's problems for them, you're in trouble already. And I had to do a lot of work on that. Between the Alexander Corporation and the School of Coaching, I did some work to help see if I could understand what was it that drew me to coaching, and what, to oversimplify it. When I was 5, there's a complete blank in my memory. And what had occurred in that time was that my sister, Hillary, who was 8, so 3 years older than I, whom I idolized, and we were very close. She died of leukemia. And my memory of that was that there was Hillary's sick room, and I kind of wasn't allowed in there. So what I took from that, what I construed out of that, was that if I don't understand what's happening for people, they'll die. which is a very unhealthy way to run around the world, I have to tell you. But boy, was it so wow. Is there, you think about that, is there any, of course I'm a coach, or somebody in some kind of similar helping profession. And to be frank, in this, it's like, I noticed that I have some of the best work I've done has been with women. I don't know, there may be other parts of that dynamic that I haven't quite explored. But until I understood that I was trying to save people, I was not going to be a great coach. So I think that in understanding what your intent is, and that means that those more intuitive responses are acceptable. Not only acceptable, but that you should start listening to them, even as a beginner. And equally, probably don't do anything about them. So I had a rule for a while, which we used to teach in the School of Coaching, which is that if a question comes to you from kind of to your imagination, or presents itself in your cranium, first of all, shut up and listen. And if it comes back 2 or 3 times, an observation, an insight, a thought, then maybe you need to attend to it. and so because and one of the questions might ask before you open your mouth and speak is you might just stop for a second and say, close your eyes and say, hold on, what's my intent in telling this person this thing? And if you can answer that question in a way that's in service of them, then maybe you should say it.
Yeah, really nice.
Yeah.
Really nice.
Yeah. So yes, the culmination of the experience and whatever else is more time in flow, but I do think that's available. So when we go back to deliberate practice, one of the really interesting things that I'm not going to do this experiment. I've got too much else to do. But what none of that science looked at was the mental state of the performers at all. It would be really interesting to see, the difference between somebody who spends 10,000 hours learning the violin in a state of fear and doubt, it being, under the imposing presence of a parent, as opposed to somebody who's learning in a state of joy and relaxed concentration.
Yeah.
What, 1/3 the time? I think
yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's a great question. I'm sad you're not going to do that. Do that research. Someone should do it.
Well, somebody should do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Myles, I want to just kind of slow down for a minute and think about like time frames, because I think there's something. So there's a community based around the podcast, and one of the members of the community asked a great question, knowing that I was going to be speaking to you about kind of, you've seen a lot change in the field of coaching. You've seen it, because I think this is right, that the Alexander Corporation, that was for you happening in the 80s. Is that
87.
right?
87, yeah.
87, yeah. And then the School of Coaching over, I guess, kind of what,
96,
late 90s, early noughties,
2011 or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really nice we touched on it a little bit already one of the reasons in effective modern coaching, when I went back to it in the last couple of weeks, you say near the start is, one of the reasons for revising it is that the world of work particularly, but the world more generally, was shifting. And so the workforce that people were coaching or in as they were coaching was different. It was a bit less command and control, a bit something different. And I guess this is going to be a big question. So take what you want from this. Like, what's been interesting, or what have you noticed about the way coaching has evolved, having seen it through all that time, especially because you've been paying attention to it a lot, because especially in the School of Coaching time? Maybe that's the first question. The second question is going to be like, what's coming, and what do you think the future of coaching is?
Yeah, it is interesting, because nobody owns coaching. Nobody has the right to say this is what it is. And I think when I started writing, I worked that out pretty damn quickly. And because I wasn't going to rubbish somebody who was doing what they were doing in a completely different approach to the way I do it, and having the success they were having. That would just be completely inappropriate. There are thousands of people out there, particularly in the world of sport, who apply really a relatively directive model. And if one was to be kind of snooty about it, you might say, well, it's really training. But nobody owns the world. Nobody owns that word. And right from the very get-go within the world of business coaching, because business coaching, interestingly, grew up here much more than it did in the States.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. I must have read you saying that somewhere. Like, that's a really interesting thing. Say some more about that.
It's like, even to this day, although there's quite some coaching going, it is a word in the business culture lexicon. It's in the States, it means corrective. It's a corrective intervention. You're failing, we'll give you some coaching. So for the most part, that's how it's understood. And there's still that a bit here, but here it's become, I think we professionalized earlier. We had some very smart people coming into, either academics or people from kind of, the world of consultancy or the world of business, who were smart and successful, or people who
are those some of the people that you mentioned already? Are there other particular ones that stand out?
Yeah, there was a lady who joined us, Heather Dawson, who joined us at the Alexander Corporation, came out of McKinsey, and she was so cool and so clear and so professional. She became part of the team at Presta. Presta were the first organized coaching house that had a in-house supervisor for their people. I mean, it just, so there was an air of professionalism amongst certain parts of either the early or the kind of the next stage emergence of coaching through the 90s, really. And that's when things like EMCC started to spread its wings. Although I'm nervous about some of what goes on in the name of coaching in these large institutions like EMCC and ICF, I have a lot of time for APEX, the Association of Professional Executive Coaches, and for EMCC, because they're profoundly well-intentioned and really trying to do the right thing.
And what's the nervousness?
What's noticeable is that, and it's back to what we were saying, which is that there is no definition of coaching. And to oversimplify, and this is true of the ICF much more so than any of the others, is that so you can't create a community where the diversity of practice is so great. So the ICF seems to me is that its primary job, whether it wants it or not, or knows it or not, is to amass as many members as it can. And that way it has clout and might be able to dictate. But you don't hear them talking much about what coaching is and making distinctions between kind of, in the old ways of speaking, directive and non-directive. So anybody can get into that church. And the only way they can do anything about it are published codes of ethics and standards. It's like, that's really not going to help anybody be a better coach. It may help them not fuck up, but it's not going to help them be a better coach. So when another damn thing comes through from one of these organizations saying we're reviewing our ethics, I go, oh great, that'll change the world. And I don't mean to be harsh, and I do mean to say that Apex, EMCC, and others have a profound mission and a great sense of responsibility. But there is a problem, which is that nobody's saying, nobody's trying to clarify what great looks like in this space in terms of the practice. And that's hard. So the shift that when we started this part of the conversation, the shift is towards greater codification. But I'm not sure we're codifying the right things. And I'm not sure what's happening out there in terms of the actual work people are doing. And then there's the second thing that I find, where I think you might know, but people listening won't, is that a number of years ago, somebody in New Zealand read my book, and it so happened that they were in charge of development of the premier rugby coaches in New Zealand. And I get an email and then a telephone call in short succession. Myles, will you run a session for our premier rugby coaches? I thought, bloody hell! I knew half the guys' names,
Yeah, because for those who don't know rugby, like New Zealand is in this period, right? Is by far the world leading operation, basically.
But nowhere close anybody else, and the pride of the nation.
Yeah.
So I literally went down they invited me down to New Zealand for one day to run a program. So I did manage to attach some pro bono stuff to that as well. And a great friend, a guy called David Webster, a number of my friends said, oh, I'll come with you. I'll carry your bags. And yeah, great. And David said, I'll come with you. And I said, great. And he said, and I'll pay my own way. And I said, fantastic. Because we've worked together in the past. He was part of the School of Coaching, a big part of the School of Coaching. And when we're both on it, we're a great team. So it was a delight. So we went down there, did our gig. Somebody tells Eddie Jones, and I get invited to do a longish program with the coaches have all left, which is significant, to help them up their game as coaches. And
wait, it's significant because of England's rugby situation, or because of what you did with him?
Eddie's style of coaching, and I'm not going to rubbish because I think he does something. He's a man of enormous integrity, and I have a profound liking for the man, and what he's trying to do, and his kind of zero tolerance around it. But zero tolerance is a dangerous game to play. So his method of coaching and mine are not necessarily, at least superficially, compatible. So I think that wasn't the best engagement that I'd ever run. But the point of the story is that if Eddie went in and saw what people were doing in the name of coaching, he'd ask one. I'm putting words in his mouth that he will never ever say. But I think what he'd say is, "What the fuck are they doing?" So where are the results? Because coaching has become predominantly, particularly in the corporate world. Now, I'm a non-executive director for an outfit called, a wonderful outfit called Action Coach, which maybe we'll come back to. And they are business coaches, and that purity of mission is fantastic. But the world of ICF and EMCC and the people in large corporates that take on coaches, you just have to look at where the buyers of coaching sit. They sit in HR, and they sit in the training part of HR. And what they're trying to do is to ensure that the people who get coaching comply. So they have to go through Myers-Briggs, or these are our values or our competencies, and you coach to that. So, okay, great. What's your job? What's your primary business objective? Nobody asks. So I think the other thing that worries me is that to some degree, coaching kind of disappears up its own backside, because it's got this need. Well, I don't know what it is. It's so focused on learning and development. One of the founders of EMCC, I had a bit of a battle at one of their meetings a good 15 years ago, and I wasn't very popular for the first time in my life. And so we organized a separate meeting. Myles has got something on his mind. Let's organize a separate meeting so that we contain it and don't infect the rest of the membership. So 10, 20 people showed up for that meeting. Amongst them, some of the founders, and I won't mention any names, of the EMCC. And I said to one of them who was sitting beside me, I said, "What's the problem? Why don't people coach for performance?" And he said, "It's very simple. We're afraid of pinning our colors to that mast." And I kind of nodded wisely, and I thought inside, there's just such a lack of integrity there.
So do you think what that person meant was, we're afraid to tie coaching to results in case it doesn't deliver?
Something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I understand that as like a coach. It is like one of the scariest bits, really, of coaching. Like sitting there, to a certain extent, listening and following interest, that's the easy bit. The bit where you say, what are we here to do? Like, what are we going to have done? How do we know in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months that we've done good work together? Like, that's scary, because, and scarier still is coming back at the end of 3, 6 or 12 months and being brave enough to go, well, where did we get to? Or obviously, hopefully, having checked in partway through. But I get that fear. That makes sense. And like you say, there's well, maybe you could speak to that the integrity gap there. Then why is it an integrity gap?
Because why else would you ask for money from an organization if it isn't to make the organization better? So it just doesn't make sense. And I think this is the really important thing I want to say, because I know that there are, and I have some friends like this who do unbelievably good work in the realm of helping people grow and develop within the context of organizations. And I am not for one moment saying that that shouldn't happen. I am saying that it's severely out of kilter. And I am saying that there's a wonderful opportunity there. But you know what? It's really difficult to get into those conversations because you're speaking to somebody relatively young and experienced in an HR role who doesn't even know what you're talking about. So the gatekeepers to performance coaching just want you to comply and join their bench and coach to the competencies or whatever it is. I don't do that. I coach to self-expression. I coach to have people achieving business results or whatever it is they want to achieve.
Yeah. And is that, I don't know if this works as a question. So if it doesn't, feel free to bat it away. It's like, if we take this kind of,
can you hold the question while I just say one thing to complete the last piece?
Yeah.
Because the other thing that I think is important is that what happens then in my world of what I call leader performance. That's what I do. And it's not leadership, it's leader. It's you acting and delivering results. When I understand what the job that they have to do is, what the results that they're there to create, and usually that means doing some things themselves, but the majority is done through other people. The question then becomes, what is it that you need to, what is it in your identity that lends to that, and that we can turn the volume up on? And what is it that you need to grow or develop that will allow that particular unique genius flourish? So, what do you need to? It's not that in my world of coaching, learning, and development doesn't happen. Good God, no. But it's in service of the results. And of course, then the learning is meaningful and it's tried out the next day. And so you were going to do this meeting differently. I ring up 2 days later. How did it go? So you're in there on the behavior. Did it, is it changing? It's a different proposition. And I interrupted your question. I apologize, but I wanted to.
I think like trust the intuition, Myles. I think this is better than what I was going to ask. And it gets to something else that was in my mind. I just want to make this clear for people who are listening, or check it with you. So, is this right? The key distinction that makes it business coaching is that there are business results that form a part of the work that is being done. And and the key distinction, and maybe it's the same thing the way you think about it now around leader performance, is that it's, again, is it the same thing? It's very much in service of that leader performing in their role in the context that they're in.
I have launched one bank that would, when I say I have launched, I didn't do it, but I coached the team that did, which was Egg, came out of Prudential. I was with that leadership team for 3 years before that bank was launched, well, 2 before it was launched. And that was the business result. They were charged by the then CEO of Prudential, Richard Harris, can't remember his first name, and to consider, first of all, to consider options for the growth of the institution. That crystallized into this idea of an online bank, first one in the UK, that actually then became that. There it was, you could see it, bricks and mortar in Dudley. I've launched another investment firm in Madrid. I've helped Goldman Sachs set up an office in Hong Kong that did all the backroom processing for Asia Pacific. So it's like no, so when I sit down with somebody, one of the questions is, so what's the job? What are we here to do? And you know what? Some people might find that threatening, and I know nothing about business really other than what I picked up by osmosis. It's just so exciting. I mean, it's just because there's the energy, the enthusiasm, everything has purpose, and I think there's a lot of merit in that, and learning is exponential.
It's different, isn't it? Because it's different kind of. Is it thinking back right to the start of this conversation and the following interest stories about the golf swing or the tennis grip or hitting the baseline or whatever it is. It's like the learning almost happens a bit by accident by focusing on the performance.
Thank you. I hadn't made that connection. You're so right. Yes, brilliant. Thank you. Got it.
Yes.
It's only taken me 30-something years, but I got it.
and Myles, just like on a really practical level, and maybe you've just said it, and I think it's just like, that's a great question. And I'm probably going to ask the next 5 clients at least that I start working with. It's like, what's the job? Like, what are we here to do? It's just such a great thing. But I'm aware, and this happens in some of my work sometimes, I always like, probably influenced by you and your book, because there's a great bit in Effective Modern Coaching about having that 3-way relationship, right? What you call the client, the player, and the coach.
Yeah.
I always ask people, what's off limits, when I'm coaching through a company, and usually, because for my integrity, I will double check. They say nothing. And I say, are you sure? Because like, is it okay, for example, for me to coach this person out of the organization if that's what they want? And they always say yes, actually. What's really interesting, every time I've done that, and I think there's quite a lot of integrity in that, actually, because
I agree.
Because that's probably for the best for everyone. But quite often there's, the person contracting the coach, or quite often a coach might end up coaching someone in an organization. And as we've had this conversation, a few of the people I've worked with, the players, in your language, have crossed my mind, where, I can look back on that and question. I don't doubt that we did the right work for that person, but actually, I don't know that person wasn't just creating, like you say, more problems for the people around them.
Yeah.
So if it's me in that situation, or another coach ends up in a situation where they're going to coach someone, but you've only really got access because of maybe this is a false assumption or something, but it feels like you've only got access to the person you're coaching. What's the most important things to make sure that coaching is closer to leader performance coaching or business coaching, and less likely to be doing the slightly less effective compliance related stuff that you've been talking about?
So the answer is in part in the way the question is phrased, because in most cases, I don't allow myself to be reliant on that individual.
Yeah.
So I will speak to the person in the introductory role, the HR buyer of coaching or whatever, will have something to say. I'll have the conversation about what's the job. I'll probably speak to their boss. In fact, I will speak to their boss if they have one. And sometimes that's the chairman. And I'll say, so, we've spoken about the role is, but what's the job right now? And that can be a very productive conversation, because actually you're effectively coaching the chairman at that moment. And then you speak to members of their team, because you want to find out equally if there's still want to find out what the job is. You want to understand more about the organizational context, culture. You want to find out how that person behaves as a leader and get some feedback for them, but also more importantly, kind of triangulate your own opinions and come to a more balanced perspective. So I find that to be not always the most enjoyable part of the engagement, but vital, because it's a way of holding us all to account.
Yeah, and I guess it goes back to that some place we jumped off on in this conversation quite a while ago about being the best consultant as well. That sounds like the best consultant in you.
Yeah, it's precisely.
Yeah. You may have already kind of spoken to this one, but in your view, obviously the distinction towards leader performance coaching or business coaching is really important for coaching as a profession. If that doesn't if people don't place enough emphasis on the result, on the job, what do you think is the risk for coaching? I think you said disappearing up its own arse, but maybe there's like a more I don't know how you can make that more real, maybe.
Well, listen, I can be really crass. What I could charge 20 years ago to coach somebody in a large, one of our retail banks for a 6-month period, and what I could now coach them, the rate I could now coach them, it just bears no comparison.
So it's gone like up exponentially.
No, it's gone down.
It's gone down.
Yeah.
Because of competition, or?
No. Well, it's partly from competition. It's partly because the the people within organizations have consolidated their approaches and say, we employ these kinds of people and we charge, and this is how you charge. And these are our rates, and you're not given an option. And so because so many places have done that, it's very difficult to break that cartel. Now I can, because I'm more often than not approached by the HR people. I'm approached by the person who is senior, who speaks to their friends and says, who should I work with? And that gets you in through another door, and you can create another.
And you're in someone else's budget, maybe.
But that's the point. Is that at a very crass level, the value of the activity is a fraction of what it was 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Seem to be, right? In terms of what organizations are willing to pay people to do this stuff. So I don't want to devalue what's being done, and I really, really don't want to cause any offense. But apart from not wanting to cause any offense, I want to be clear that actually that stuff can be hugely valuable to people. But it's not the value that it could be. And I think it's less about it's less that it's damage. I just think it's a pity that we're depriving people of the opportunity of flourishing and being successful in their places of work. And it wouldn't take that much in order to do it. But on the other way I think about it is, boy, is this an opportunity. There's one organization in this country that's growing, and it's growing exponentially. And it's Action Coach. And it's a different kind of fish. These people, and when I first met them something like 20 years ago, I was a bit dubious, because they were effectively training owners of businesses, small and medium-sized enterprises, on the essentials of running a business. One-on-one training. And it was brilliantly documented and brilliantly worked through. And they were doing, and they've grown and they've grown and they've grown, and the people they're attracting are maybe different from those in the early days, although even then you could see because what we've created in the last few years is they've begun to synthesize the stuff that I know with the stuff that they know. So these guys are going out and they've got a really honest remit. And the direction of travel is something like, you've built this business up, you're struggling to grow it any further, you want to retire in 5 years' time. We're here to help you do that. And they do it by good business common sense and processes that they put in place, and having a good advisor at your side, and increasingly by being great coaches. So I just think there's a kind of an honesty to that model. I am being paid by you, and I will get the next client because you profit. You're better off, your business is better, your people are happy, or you can now retire, or whatever it is that you want, or acquire the next business, or whatever it is I think it's, for me, that there's an honesty to that. And I forgive this slight detour, and we did speak about it, Robbie, earlier. Just so you know, anybody who's listening, that organization, Action Coach, is it doesn't require you to be a great business person, because they'll train you in those techniques. They are growing fast, and much more to come. Their values are really, really now quite extraordinary. The fact that they've kind of absorbed me and my ethos into the business and continue to do that, and want me to be around, is a statement in itself, I think, if that's not unduly self-aggrandizing. But so it's a franchise model. You can buy a franchise, and you can find the finance to do that. And there are people in that business, and they're turning over more than 100,000 a month, and they're getting all the support they need. So if you're interested, talk to me. You'll find me on the internet, in either buying one of those franchises, or just, they're looking for good coaches. Boy, are they looking for good coaches. And I repeat, they are the only coaching organization of any size in this country, and probably anywhere else, that's growing and growing fast. So pitch aside, I apologize, back to the chase.
But it's also, I think it's the perfect time for the pitch, because it is that, what happens if you try and tie it so tightly to the results, which is why many people would come to coaching in the first place. Well, everyone would come to coaching in the first place for some kind of result. Otherwise, they wouldn't be parting with their money.
I've just remembered a ridiculous story. many years ago, I was coaching somebody, and they were, this was in tennis, and some of the essence of, you know, the principles were already present. And I said, so what's your goal? Well, I want to beat my husband. The trouble was, I got myself out of a job because 3 weeks later she beat her husband.
Yeah.
Coaching stopped.
Yeah.
Our goal.
It is a risky thing.
I should have put in a performance bonus.
Yeah. It is that. I mean, that is a risky thing when you work with clients. That if you do
it's happened more than once.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That it finishes early, and then you got to, like, well, in that situation, that kind of situation, I'm always trying to think, okay, but in the long term, what's best for me? What's best for me is to achieve an amazing result in 3 weeks with that woman, right?
Yeah, and now you've got an advocate.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think I've always been, because that's what I was saying earlier about not being so commercial. I'm now much better at saying, so if there's anybody in your network who you think could use my services, let them know.
Yeah.
And they do.
And Myles, like, we've been talking for a long time. We've covered so much ground. I want to be respectful of your time and also listeners' time, because they've probably got other things to be going on to with their day too.
Still here.
Yeah. Oh, there will be. Don't worry about that. It's interesting that we haven't got. I'm really glad that we've touched in some ways on the scaffold of enabling genius, because I think there's so much in that book for people to pick up and take with them, in whether they're a coach or not. I'm really glad we've covered a lot of what's in effective modern coaching in different ways, and in your ideas around coaching. We haven't really touched on Boost Leadership, which is the startup. We touched on it. We haven't got into it. I mean, I'm really curious, but probably that's for another conversation, another time. But maybe just before we finish, what is there that you've got coming up in your work or life that you're excited about?
Well, I one of the things that has sustained me, so working in a startup is, and this one in particular, has been very tough. And we set out to create a unique product the world hasn't seen before, that actually delivers learning on a mobile phone. And we are getting, I don't know if you look into the statistics on how successful mobile learning is, it's kind of like in the 20-25% of people signing up, people staying at it, all of those things. It's nonsense. We're getting north of 95% people signing up, completing, and we've built in tests into it, so we know that they're learning. So people are passing, 95% of people are passing at 80% or more, the score they get. So it's totally gamified. It's got coaching embedded in it. So
you can see, for people who can go on the website, there's, like, you can see the Myles Downey stamp as well, and some of the things you can kind of read on the visuals and things.
The essential teaching is done through role plays, and in interactive role plays. It's gamified, so you get scores and you learn the stuff. And then we do some action learning where you're given tiny little missions to go out and, if it's the one on feedback, for instance, it's, give feedback to a member of your team, but we break that down into 5 tiny little steps for you to take: identify the person, arrange the meeting, plan the meeting, and we help you plan the meeting. So the coaching is built into it. So it's gone an absolute bomb. It's just been, I think we're just about to be acquired, which would be wonderful. And then because that's not what I went there to. I've been working on the notion of a kind of a virtual coach for about 20, actually more years. So it's great to have that one out of the system, so I don't have to think about it anymore. Because the savior of the last of working in that intense environment and lockdown has been the small number of coaches that players that I've kept on board, and my work with Action Coach, because once a month we have a morning where I work with their people in a large group to talk through some principles maybe, and then with a small group where I do something that's much more specific and sometimes even looks a bit like supervision. So that's been just wonderful, and it looks like I'm going to be doing more of that work with Action Coach in the next few years, and I relish it. It's when people keep coming back to you after the session and saying, you said this, what did you tell me more about what you meant, or can I ask these questions? So you're making that difference, and that difference translates into thousands of business across the country. That's exciting. Leader coaching is exciting too. Leader performance coaching. Working with, I'm talking about working with kind of 10 people in any given month, but in a relatively intense way. I've just a guy called Ian Harrison has helped me write a book, which is about, from the strapline won't be this, but in essence it is. It's from command and control to align and enable. So it's the enabling manager is the title. That'll be out in the spring. Sounds good, doesn't it? And then the next book is something that I've been writing all my life, which is a thing called The Sessions, which takes a series of 8 conversations, so paralleling the coaching conversation, that takes place in Dublin pubs, where a guy with a business problem in Donaghy and Nesbitt's bumps into a softly spoken person with a mid-Atlantic accent who's older and wiser. And they have a conversation that leads to the guy taking a big, brave step. So it kind of follows the hero's journey as a model, but it takes you through all the stages of enabling genius. But that's very much in the background. What you're getting is the story of 2 guys drinking too much Guinness in a pub in Dublin, where the ball catching demonstration that you mentioned plays out with a lemon. Nice. With a guy called Butterfingers, because he can't catch.
Yeah. And when's that one, Myles? Or is that too far in the future to know?
I'm hoping that I'll be able to, that'll be finished within the next year. There might even be a chapter on my website. If not, I'll put one up. It's so much fun to write. But it's about, and then if I've been completely overindulgent, I played tennis in my youth to quite a high level. In the last 10 years, as part of the Enabling Genius Project, my genius project was to identify my unique individual genius on the tennis court, and to relearn how to play tennis in line with that identity. And it's meant that every single behavior and skill has been relearned. It's taken me, because I can only play once a week at the most, it's taken me 6 years, probably more. No more, because I've had a number of injuries, and I'm now hitting the ball at 62 harder than I was when I was 26. I mean, like, significantly. And it's the moment of greatest exhilaration during the week.
Yeah, I'm glad you told that story, because I was going to ask about it, because it's a great Enabling Genius came out a few years ago, and so in that book there is not the denouement of that story, but I love that you took that project. Like, what a powerful way to learn about whether you're getting it right in the book, right?
And let me, maybe this is, you'll be the judge of it, maybe it's supposed to finish, I don't know, but let me, because the idea of identity is so vital. There have been 2 coaches along the way in particular in this phase of relearning to play tennis. And it took me a while to get them to realize that we can't just patch me up. We can't just kind of correct the faults and put a sticking plaster on it, because I'll just do myself injury. It's got to be fucking perfect. So it's like how kids play now. And when one of the coaches said, okay, when he got it, he said, so let's just take a step back. He said, what's your signature? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, who do you look like? So he was clever enough to identify people from my era, McEnroe, Edberg, 1 or 2 others. And so he said, so we kind of began to form a composite of the bits of those players. And that was when the idea of identity began to take grip. And then that got worked on for a number of months, and it got down to something which I now have on the back of my sweatshirt, which is Big Zen Cat. One word, capital B, capital Z, capital C. And it's an absolutely authentic expression of the person who, one, shows up in life, but also shows up on the tennis court. Because big means that because I've relearned to play, I hit the ball with more topspin and with more power than anybody in my age group. I mean, they're all wearing bandages anyway, so it's like, but so this ball is coming in onto the baseline, and the hit is threatening. It's big. I'm also left-handed, which means the ball naturally goes cross-court into my opponent's backhand, which is always more difficult. Zen means it's about how I manage myself. And at first I thought that was kind of like, some people do that kind of very put on their game face and no visible inflection of the skin of the face, no signals or no nothing. And it took me a while to learn out that was completely ridiculous, because I was having so much fun inside expressing myself, but I needed to giggle a bit more. And cat means is that my strategy is designed to kill the ball within 3 hits. I remember saying to my coach at one point, I said, Ben, there's a real problem. I said, it gets to kind of the 4th or 5th hit of the ball, and my technique begins to disintegrate. And he looked at me. This guy was 23 years old, and he said, yeah. I said, well, it's disintegrating. He said, yeah, but you're supposed to win the point in 3 strokes. But apart from the humor of that, once I know it's big Zen cat, that now dictates my strategy and my tactics on the court completely. It tells me what I need to learn and develop. It's just, and this nonsense that people in sports say about having, you got to believe in yourself. This is horseshit. It's the most dangerous thing you can ever say to anybody. What you've got to believe in is in what you're doing. You got to believe in your game. And that's how little bit of detachment is really helpful. So boy, do I believe in Big Zen Cat, and I know how to. So what I'm trying to do with people in the world of work is to establish what that identity is as a leader, and have them live it. And when they do, it's typically very, very powerful.
Yeah, do you get them sweatshirts with their identity on them?
No, but it's a brilliant idea.
You should definitely do it. You should definitely do it. Myles, it's been such a pleasure. Before we ring up, is there anything that you want to kind of say to listeners, or anywhere in particular you would point them if they want to learn more about you or your work?
I would point you to 2 places I'd get people to, yes, read Tim. The first game on Inner Game of Tennis is, no, there's a very little known book called Inner Tennis, difficult to get hold of. But the first 4 chapters are stunning, because he does the best job ever of condensing the principles. It's much better in terms of, the other is more kind of poetic and, 60s America, California, humanistic movement and kind of good stuff. This is much more practical. So Inner Tennis is worth looking at. I am a complete fan of George Kelly and his notions of personal construct theory. Trevor Butt, B-U-T-T, wrote a really good book that I can't remember the name of, on personal construct theory. It's to hand, but, and it always is. The Shaper of Personal Meaning by Trevor Butt, George Kelly. That's been, because it tells you in that idea of construct so much about how we form that identity and how we bring it into the world. So it's kind of before we started speaking about non-directive coaching, that's the reason why that tells you why it makes sense. And then the other place that's worth going is, of course, Assagioli and psychosynthesis, and reading a bit on that. And there was something else, but I've completely forgotten. Oh, yes. The pinnacle of performance as a human being is linked to a mental state known as flow. So remind yourself of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi and his work on flow. And those things, that's the kind of as a Catholic, that's the Holy Trinity.
Nice.
Elapsed Catholic, clearly.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. We'll put links to all that wherever people are listening to this. But look, Myles, it's been an absolute blast to have this conversation with you. Thanks so much. Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for doing this, for your listeners. Thank you to you all for listening, and it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.